And we do want to wish all of you a very happy Mother's Day. All of you that are mothers and all of you that do the job of mothering. Sometimes some of our best mothers are not necessarily our biological mothers because of situations and circumstances and because of the role that so many play in our lives. And as a result, we're going to continue in our series of messages dealing with relational traits and toxicity. Today we actually kind of turn a corner and we'll begin to look at some of those toxic things that are involved in a lot of different relationships. And this will definitely not be your typical everyday average Mother's Day sermon, because it really won't address that, but it will address toxic relationships. As I mentioned at the conclusion of last week, we were talking about building these relationships. We've talked about the start of them. We've talked about the sustaining of them. We actually, in the introduction to this series, talked about structuring them. And so we're doing all of this in order to see how we succeed in these relationships. What can we learn that will aid us and help us as we make our way in and through and along this life journey of making and establishing and succeeding at our various relationships. In looking at each one of these, we begin today by looking to try to see and to summarize some of Saul's toxicity in his relationships. Now, this could be a very, very long series because there's a lot in the Scriptures in the conclusion of the last half of the book of 1 Samuel that deal with Saul and some of the difficulties he had with all the different people in his life. We're not going to do that because we simply just don't have that kind of time. We're going to try over the next 3 weeks, today included, today and the next 2 Sundays, to, Lord willing, look at Saul's toxicity in these relationships and some of the bigger pieces of that we can draw from and learn from how to evaluate the people that are in our life that are toxic. And so today, in this first one, I'm going to invite you to take and turn your copy of God's Word to join me in 1 Samuel chapter 10. While you're turning there, let me give you the background. In 1 Samuel chapter 9, we find that Saul is introduced as this young man whose daddy's donkeys have gone missing. And so Saul takes one of the servants, and the two of them go and search throughout the land to try to find these donkeys. And as he's gone, he begins to believe that maybe it's been long enough and they haven't found these donkeys, and that his dad is now going to stop worrying about the donkeys and start worrying about him. And so he suggests that they return. Well, the servant says, look, we're real close to this town where a seer, a prophet lives, Samuel. Let's go see him. Perhaps he will tell us where these donkeys are. And so they begin to make their way there, and Saul asked, what do we have to give to Samuel? What gift do we have? I mean, you need to pay for this, so how do we pay for this? And so the servant says, I've got half a shekel to give it. And so they make their journey. They find Samuel. And Samuel had been told the day before by God that God was going to send him a person. And when this person arrived, that would be the next ruler. That would be the next king. That would be the first king that Israel ever had, because God was going to relent and allow Israel to have a king, even though they had never had one before. They wanted one, so they said, and they had, as the conversation between God and Samuel went, God said to Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. Because up to that point, the man of God, this seer, this one that was the prophet, he pretty much spoke to the people on behalf of God, and that's pretty much how the decisions were made, in accordance with God's plan as revealed through God's man. Well, the nation of Israel had said, we want a king. We want to be like everybody else. Give us a king. And so Samuel was despondent about that and had been talking with God about that. And you find that in the prior chapters of 1 Samuel. So in 9, Saul's out. He's looking for these. They meet up. They come together with Samuel. And so Samuel says to Saul, you need to stay with me tonight. I'm having a feast tomorrow, and you don't know it, but you're kind of going to be the honored guest. Now, he didn't reveal all of that to him, but he begins and he anoints Samuel and anoints Saul as this ruler, the next king. Well, there wasn't anybody really present other than, just those that were there at that time. And so in that way, Samuel has seen the power shift to Saul. But Saul, who has seen this, isn't quite sure that's what he should do or the direction or why. And he has all these things that are clamoring in his head and in his heart against going with what Samuel has revealed is the will of God. So he spends the night. The next day, he gets ready to depart after having had the feast and eating the meal that had been prepared just for him, and so in honor of him. And so Samuel calls him aside and he says, now you're leaving. 3 things are going to happen to you today. And he describes in great detail, and they're given to you in the opening chapter of chapter 10 of 1 Samuel. He says, these 3 things are going to happen. Now, I think he's giving Saul these words so that Saul will see this guy does know what he's talking about. And as a result, it will affirm everything that he has said, because this is the authority that God is putting his stamp of approval on what Saul has been ordained to do, what he has been anointed to do, what he's been called to do, and that which Samuel has instructed him in. So it's at this juncture that 2 of the 3 things have happened. The third one comes along, and the third one is saying that when he approaches a certain city, there's going to be a whole bunch of these sons of the prophets who are going to come out. And Saul, who has never done that before, is going to join in, and he's going to begin to prophesy. He's going to begin to also speak for God. And as a result of doing that third thing, the people seeing that, and they begin to wonder, hey, isn't that Kish's son? That's Saul. We know him. He's not a prophet. Why is he in there prophesying? And all of a sudden, there is this reputation instantaneously, pretty much, that begins to go throughout the land, and they begin to ask the question, so is Saul now a son of the prophet? Is he one of the prophets? And so now, as Saul's reputation is being built as one who speaks for God, we come to 1 Samuel chapter 10. Drop with me down to verse number 9. In that passage, it says this, and I'm reading this morning from the Christian Standard. It says, when Saul turned to leave Samuel, notice this phrase, God changed his heart. Now that's an important role and an important statement, an important phrase in verse number 9. And all the signs, the 3 things that Samuel had predicted, they all came about or came true that day. Verse 10. When Saul and his servant arrived in Gibeah, a group of prophets met him. Then the Spirit of God came powerfully on him, and he prophesied along with them. Everyone who knew him previously and saw him prophesy with the prophets asked each other, what has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets? Then a man who was from there asked, and who is their father? As a result, is Saul also among the prophets became a popular saying. Then Saul finished prophesying, and he went to the high place. Verse 14. Saul's uncle asked him and his servant, where did you go? To look for the donkey, Saul answered. When we saw they weren't there, we went to Samuel. Tell me, Saul's uncle asked, what did Samuel say to you? Saul told him, he assured us the donkeys had been found. However, Saul did not tell him what Samuel had said about the matter of kinship. Verse 17. Samuel summoned the people to the Lord at Mizpah and said to the Israelites, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought Israel out of Egypt, and I rescued you from the power of the Egyptians and all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God, who saves you from out of troubles and afflictions. You said to him, 'You must set a king over us.' Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord and the tribes, by your tribes and clans." Samuel had the tribes of Israel come forward, and the tribe of Benjamin was selected. Now they're casting lots here to see where this king is going to come from and who he's going to be. Then he had the tribe of Benjamin come forward by its clans, and the Matrite clan was selected. Finally, Saul said to Cush, the son of Cush was selected. But when they searched for him, they could not find him. They again inquired of the Lord. In other words, they cast lots again. "Has the man come here yet?" And the Lord, by means of the lots that were cast, replied, "There he is, hiding among the supplies." Now, some of you may have the word baggage there or luggage there. It's probably more likely that this is, the things that kept the supplies. And so he's hiding there. Verse 23. "They ran and got him from there. When he stood among the people, he stood a head taller than anyone else. Samuel said to the people, 'Do you see the one the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among the entire population.' And all the people shouted, 'Long live the king.'" Samuel proclaimed to the people the rights of kingship. What Samuel did now was to describe to the people what he had prophesied. Said, "Are you sure you want someone like this to rule over you? Because here's what's going to happen to you." And most of what he listed was negative. And so here he tells them, these are the things that a king does, and these are the things that a king deserves. He wrote them on a scroll, which he placed in the presence of the Lord. Then Samuel sent all the people home. Saul also went to his home in Gibeah, and brave men whose hearts God had touched went with him. But some wicked men said, "How can this guy save us?" They despised him and did not bring him a gift. But Saul said nothing. The first thing I want to talk about this morning as we look at this passage, we're going to kind of look at this passage from three different vantage points. The first one, of course, is the story itself. Just looking at what Samuel and Saul and all the people were there, how that story unfolds and is unpacked for us. That then will reveal the second part, which is how it affects us. What does this say to us as modern-day Christians? And then, of course, the third thing is how does it relate to this whole matter of toxicity in relationships? So we're going to be looking at each one of those things as we walk through. So the first thing I would have you to notice is the change of routes by a rescue. In this passage, some have questioned, why did God see fit in this passage to go back and talk about the Israelites whom he had delivered from Egypt and put them on a new course, a new path, a new route, a new direction in life? He changed their location, and he changed them from being slaves to basically now moving forward as his chosen people to occupy this promised land that he had been promised to Abraham some 400 plus years earlier. And so the changing of their life's route, the changing of the direction of their life came because of a rescue. God rescued the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. And of course, slavery in Egypt is a picture of the lostness of every human being. Every person ever born is lost. They do not have a personal relationship with God. And until that point, they come to allow God to rescue them from the world, from Egypt, from their sin, from themselves, from Satan. They are still lost. But at a certain point, some people who God will touch will proclaim that Jesus is Lord, and as a result of that salvation, they will be rescued by God. They will be restored by God. They will be made whole. They will be saved. They will be delivered. They will be set free. And so the direction of their life changes completely. In this story, Saul says, or Saul, it is described of Saul, that God touched his heart. In fact, God gave him a new heart. God changed him, and he became a different person. If you were to go back to verse number 6 in this passage, in chapter 10, verse 6, it will tell you how that God changed his heart, and he became a different person. The CSB says that God changed his heart, and he was transformed. God revolutionized Saul, and then he called him. And that's the way it works. God begins a work in you. God changes you. God begins to do work in your life. And then he calls you to do something, because God is never going to call you to do something that hasn't equipped you to do it first. That's the equipping. When Samuel said to Saul, God has a plan and a purpose for your life, and you need to live it out. Before Saul was expected to do that, God would need to equip him. And the way God would equip him would first be to give him a new heart. And so giving him a new heart meant he had a new lease on life. He had a new passion. That's the reason why these three things that were signs were being confirmed, so that Saul could look and say, you said these things were going to happen. They did happen. So this change is from the Lord. So I can go with it. I can afford to be something I have never been before. I can launch myself into being one of the prophets, because you will speak to me and through me, and I need to count on and rely on you. It is you who have changed me, not me. It is you who have called me, not me. It is your equipping that enables me to do what you call me to do. So therefore, as long as I am dependent on you, I will have the strength to do all that you've asked of me. So this change of routes, change of direction, came because of a rescue. God equipped Saul by giving him a new heart. That being the case, notice the second thing that takes place. The change that comes by rejecting a ruler. Now this begins in the story by rehearsing for us that the Israelites who had been rescued have now reached a point where they wanted to change horses in midstream, to use an old saying. They wanted a different ruler. The God who had delivered them, the God who had transformed them, the God who had called them, the God who had promised them the promised land, that God was no longer enough now that they had received his blessings, now that they had received all that he had promised. Now they want to do something different. As a result, they want to exchange their God for a ruler like everybody else. We no longer want to be special. We want to be God. People, yeah, in terms of getting his blessing, but when it comes to the way we conduct our life, the way we do our business, we just want to be like everybody else. We don't want to be special like that. So we're going to swap God as our ruler, reject him, and ask for a king. We need a new head. We need somebody else to head us up. And we don't want to be different than everybody else. Let's be like everybody else. Can I pause here long enough to say that God, who has a perfect plan for your life, knows what is best for your life. And to reject his way, to reject him, his calling, his plan, his purpose, is for us to really not only say we want to do it our own way, we want to do it like everybody else is doing it, but it is also the way in which we snub God, the way in which we turn our back on Him, and the way in which we say, God, you're great in some ways, and in the ways that benefit me, I will bless you and praise you and worship you. But when it comes to doing business, when it comes to the matter of orchestrating a nation, when it comes to defense, when it comes to military prowess, we don't want you. We'll take it like everybody else has it. This is the image and this is the picture of a Christian who, having begun, as Paul would say later, begun with the Lord, stop walking with Him because of a difference in you that is making you look different than everybody else, by which you have now become self-conscious, and as a result, you kind of don't want to be different anymore. As a result, this new head, and I use this picture of England has a new king now, all right? Just current events, okay? It doesn't have anything to do with the message. I just want you to know we're up on current events. You know, we may live in the South, but we still know what's going on in the world, amen? All right, so anyway, a new head, a new king, a new ruler. And it depicts the idea that having begun with God, they're now willing to abandon God because God no longer is the answer, they think, to their problems. You see, when they had no resources, when they had nothing, when they were slaves, when they were being oppressed, they would run to God. Oh, God, 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 please, 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 please. But now that that's no longer the case, let's do it our way. Let's try and go this our own route. Now, you and I know from a reading of this passage and our understanding of history, they were still in trouble. All the nations around them were attacking them relentlessly. And they had a big problem with the Philistines. And they wanted a king who would deliver them from the Philistines, who were no match for the Egyptians when the Egyptians had their rule over them. But they seemingly had forgotten what God had done and how God had rescued them and how God had delivered them and how God started this journey. But He wasn't done yet, but they were. They wanted to do it like everybody else. When they come against us, they get 100,000 people. We need 101,000 people. We just got to get better than them. Well, that whole idea of the change that takes place in the story and the change that takes place in their life comes because they rejected God ruling over them. Now, if you're following carefully along in the passage, you have seen that Samuel has described this process in the ark and in the life of Israel as a people. Unbeknownst to those who were hearing it at the moment, he was also describing Saul's journey. Saul, who God had just changed his heart, who God had just done this big thing in his life. Saul would eventually come to say, you know, I'll do it my way. I don't have to listen to God or the man of God. I'll just do what I think is best. After all, I'm in charge. I am the king. But before we get to that Saul, we have to see where that attitude started. Where the roots, if that's the fruit, where are the roots to that problem? So we can back up and we can begin with this story because this literally is the beginning. It happens almost immediately. I mean, we're talking about day, and now this third day. This has happened rapidly. And now it is time for Samuel to anoint Saul publicly and let the whole nation know, you wanted a guy? Here's the guy. Samuel has already had this done in private. It is now time to do it in public. But when he's doing this in public, he lets the people know, we're only doing this today because you have rejected God. And rather than hearing and seeing and learning the lesson of that, Samuel is hiding in the luggage. He's hiding among the supplies. You see this next picture in your worship guides. There's a change by refusing responsibility. This is where the new heart that Saul had been given begins to go dark. This is where there comes a point where Saul needs to recognize what has taken place and what is going on. And as a result, he takes a step backwards. And that change that God had wrought in him is now going to be different. There's a change because he's refused responsibility. What does that mean? Well, he's trying to escape. If you recall, his idea was, who am I that I should do this? I'm from the smallest family, clan, tribe, and I'm from the smallest clan within that tribe. We're basically nothing and nobodies. How is it that you think that I can do all of this? I am not worthy. Well, to be not worthy, what he is doing is he is pretending. Most of those who read this, whether a psychologist or professor or theologian, virtually all of them recognize and say that this is a false humility. He is trying to describe and to say, you know, I am just not really quite that guy. I don't have the ability. And to say that he doesn't have the ability is for him to discount God who changed his heart, God who said, I will equip you. You will never do anything that I will not cause and say, do this. And when I say do it, I will give you the power. He is discounting that, and he is believing, I got to do this in my own strength. This is where that seed begins. What it amounts to is, I can't trust God. He may have done something okay for me in the past. He may have completed those 3 signs. He may have done this and that and the other, but you know what? Ultimately, I just can't trust him that I should be the ruler because I am nothing. Now, for those who, you know, in psychology and those who have taken and looked and tried to contemplate the mentality and the personality of Saul, the word they have used more often than not is a word modesty. He is portraying a false modesty. Well, that's interesting because the word modesty, you know, we talk about, you know, everybody ought to be modest. Well, the original word modest comes from the root M-E-T-E, which is meet, like meter or measure. To meet or to measure means to measure out or to take and measure something. What is it that is measured? And why do you measure it? When you look at what is measured, modesty is that which is within measure. Those who say, I can do anything, I can do everything, I'm the greatest, are out of bounds because they are beyond the measure of their ability. They believe more highly of themselves than they ought. And just like that is wrong, when we flip to the other side of the spectrum, those who say, well, I can't do anything right, I never do anything good, I am just terrible, oh, woe is me, and Eeyore comes out in them. You know Eeyore? Okay, Piglet, and I started saying Humpty Dumpty. I mean, what? Winnie the Pooh. There you go, Winnie the Pooh. So when Eeyore comes out, oh, woe is me, I'm terrible, I'm awful, that is not true either. And if you're not within the measure, if you're not inside of that measurement, you are not modest, you are not proper, you are not right. And what happens is this humility that you are trying to portray, it's false, it's bad, it's wrong. It discounts God in you. So the people over there think they are enough, they don't need God. And the people over here saying, even me with God is not enough. That too is wrong. So for us to recognize that, Saul is going to begin here by refusing his responsibility. So he's hiding. He's hiding out. He does not want to complete what God has started. He doesn't want to fulfill God's plan for his life. Now recall, this is not beginning. God has already called him, anointed him, given him signs, prophesied through him, spread his reputation. There have been event after event after event after event that God has done to confirm, Saul, you're my guy. I will be with you. I have put a new heart in you. I have transformed you. I have made you different. You are prepared. You are right. You are ready. And there is nothing that the two of us cannot do. But Saul would rather hide out than take God at his word. When you begin a relationship with God, you commit your life to following him. Not just being a fan from afar off or applauding the things you think you see God do, but following him, as Tim mentioned this morning during the welcome. And you will change your life, and you will change the course of your life when you change the ruler in your life by negating and rejecting and refusing the responsibilities that ruler has imposed on you. See, it's not Saul's plan to be king. It's God's plan for Saul to be king. And for Saul to reject that opportunity, that responsibility, is for him to also reject God. So what does that mean? Well, I know you're real glad to see that word, right? So in conclusion, let's apply that not just to the story of Samuel and Saul and Israel and to us as believers, but let's also apply it to our relationships. Let's begin with the shifting of destiny. Every relationship you engage in changes the trajectory and the direction of your life. Changes the course of your life. It gives you a new destiny. Gives you a new design for life. Gives you a new way to do life. Gives you a new partner to do life with. Every relationship represents a shifting, if you will, of your destiny. And when you begin to recognize how much you care for this person and how much you love them and how you have, whether it is a child, you know, some have said, the only way for you to realize what it means to be a parent is to realize that that means your heart will walk outside of your body because of your love for your children. Whatever relationship you're talking about, you're putting it in these terms of the eternal. You're putting it in terms of, I love you. There is, till death do us part. There is this idea, there is this way of saying, you have changed my life. You've given me a new heart. You've given me a new direction. You've given me a new course. And as a result of that, I am committed to you, to this relationship. And it has changed me. It has changed my life. You are changing me. I am better with you than I am without you. And as a result, you are acknowledging in that relationship there has been a shift of destiny. If you will, we can call that, or we can label that here simply as, I have found a new motive for living. You have now become the foundation for everything that motivates me. If this is a relationship with God, if this is a relationship with another human being, as a result, you have altered me. My motives now are different. My motives are to love you. My motives now are to fulfill you. My motives now are to serve you. And as a result, you have shifted. You have changed my destiny. But eventually, in every relationship, there comes a point in time where you must make a decision. And making that decision when you decide to go back to self-centeredness, when you decide to go back to selfishness, when you decide to go back to letting yourself be in charge, letting yourself be the focus, letting you be the one who calls the shots, and you do everything for your own benefit, you have scorned that relationship you have. You have put scorn on the relationship, and most importantly, you have scorned the deity. You have changed rulers. You are saying, God, your plan was great to start with, but I can't finish with it. I'm going to change plans. I'm going to change horses in midstream. I'm going a different direction. I want a new man in my life. I want a new woman in my life. I want a change. I want this thing to happen. And as a result, I'm going to reject what you started and where we began and the new heart you've put in me. I'm going to allow to be corrupted. I'm going to be allowed to be tempted away from serving you. And I'm going to begin to look at things from my own perspective, for my own benefit. And as a result, I am going to mock and scorn the very life that began at the very start of this. And as a result, what will happen is when it comes to this, I've become fond of something else. Here we found a motive. Here, the model for us, this mood for us is, what am I fond of now? What appeals to me today? What do I find my fondness in? And what do I find rewarded when I give my fondness to that thing? What's my new mood like? When someone is struggling, let me just ask you to think about this for a minute. When somebody is struggling, do they have a happy, carefree mood? And when you walk in a room with them and they're struggling and you just feel the warmth radiating out from them, you feel loved and cared for and protected, you feel great just to be in their presence? Or do you sense, even in their mood, that something is foul, something is wrong, something is false, something is troubling, something else has come about, and their fondness has been negated, or at least has been transferred onto something else? I mentioned to you the idea of us focusing our attention on ourselves as opposed to the one we're in a relationship with. This is where you say, I have once again become so fond of myself, I have no fondness left over to give to you. And my mood will reflect that toward you. Have you ever been in the presence of somebody that, man, they used to be your best friend? I mean, they were your bestie. I mean, you just did everything with them. You were tight. This was a great relationship. But then something somehow, some way changed. And now when you're in the room with them, you sense a different mood from them. I used to say it this way. It's like being in a conversation with someone, and while you're in the conversation with someone, they're looking around the room to see who else they should be talking to or who else they want to be talking to, because you're just not that important to them anymore. You can't do anything for them. You can't help them. You can't benefit them. You can't bless them. You can't help them get further. So as a result, they're looking for the next person to be in a relationship with, because that person can give me more. That person can do for me more. That person has more to give. That person has something else I want. And as a result, you will scorn those previous relationships, and you will begin to say, okay, I now am in charge. Even though God gave me that new heart, I'm going to use that heart to love something other than Him. When that is the case, that mood that comes here, you'll see that shifting fondness take a different route. And as a result, there will be a different product. You'll begin to shirk your duty. You see, Saul hiding out was a statement about what he felt about the kingship. Now, I know that the scriptures end this story by saying that there were some worthless fellas who said, how can this guy lead us? And the reason they said, how can this guy lead us, is because when it came time to stand up, when it came time to be counted, when it came time to say, I am the leader of this group of people, he's hiding. And they took that personally. Not only was it an affront to them and an affront to the kingship, It was an affront to bearing the responsibility of identifying with them. And they looked and they said, you know what? He not only doesn't want to be one of us, he doesn't want to be the leader of us. He's shirking that responsibility, but he doesn't really even want to do anything to identify with us. He's a coward. He's hiding out like cowards do. Why would we want him to rule us? We need a military might. We need some leadership. We need some guidance. Who wants a coward for a leader? Why is a coward a coward? Ever thought about it? Why do people do cowardly things? Because there's nothing more important than themselves. They're thinking about themselves. You look at those people that were courageous in battles. Go back and watch all those movies that came out of World War I and World War II and all those plans where somebody was willing to sacrifice themselves in order to help, in order to deliver, in order to save, in order to do something for someone else that called on them to make a self-sacrifice. Those people were not cowards because their love wasn't of them and for themselves. Cowards have a love for themselves. You know why a woman won't respect a cowardly man? Because she knows in her heart of hearts that a cowardly man is in love with himself and not in love with her. And if he's not willing to step up and protect her because he might get hurt, he doesn't care whether she gets hurt or not. See, that's what cowardliness is. It's a shirking of a duty. It's a shirking of a responsibility. It is to sidestep it. It is to portray a false modesty on one side or fake bravado on the other side. And either way, however it is, you get to the point where you just say, I don't want to do that. So these people that were called these rascals, these scoundrels is more proper, these worthless fellows who identified Saul as one who was only interested in himself and thus disqualified from being a ruler, who loved himself more than he loved his people, and therefore he was a coward. Those people who properly identified him weighed in and said, they wanted nothing to do with him. So why did the Bible call them worthless if they were identifying properly the situation? Let me back you up. You remember the story? It wasn't Saul who chose to be king. God chose him to be king. Though they have properly assessed Saul's character, he is a coward. He is in love with himself. He's only thinking about himself. He's not thinking of anybody else, just him. They're correct in that assessment. But they forgot that they too had a duty. They too had a responsibility, and it was to obey God. And God has clearly selected this man. And Samuel, whom they did respect, had said, this is God's man for the hour. And because of that, they refused to submit to God's plan because they didn't understand that God had selected him even though he was cowardly. And even though he would become the Saul we know. I started to say the Saul we love, but that's probably not the case. The Saul we loathe. Even though he was going to become that, these folks were only expressing the truth. But do you know that you can say the truth and not say the truth in love? And you know what you do when you point out the obvious but fail to show the hand of God behind the obvious? You're shirking your duty. You see, you're not to evaluate the same way the world evaluates. I could see this if this were just a regular group of people and this were not God's people. But these are God's people. They're supposed to see differently. They're supposed to look at things differently. They're supposed to look at things by coming from the hand of God. They're supposed to see things differently than the world does. And they didn't. Thus, the Bible describes them as scoundrels. Not because their assessment of Saul was wrong. They were right. But do you know that it's possible to be right and be ever so wrong at the same time? That's what this end of the story tells us. Saul shirked his duty. And these people who said, oh, you know what? He's just kind of a scoundrel. If I had time, I would race you forward and say, you remember what happened with David when Saul turned his back on David? Saul twice tried to spear him with a spear, a javelin. He tried to kill him. David had at least two, many more, but at least two opportunities where he could have killed Saul. But he didn't, because he said, I'll not raise my hand against God's anointed. This is God's man. God put him here, and God will take him out when it's time. Till then, I'll just show my support for him. Even while he tries to kill me, I'll just hide out. I'll just run away. And at that point, Saul had knowingly lost the kingdom because it had been told to him by Samuel, and David had already been anointed the next king. But David was unwilling to step up to do a responsibility God had called him to do until he let God do God's part. That's the thing we ignore when we make decisions. That's the thing we ignore in our relationships. What God has called you to, He will see you through. But when He's called you to something and you abandon that responsibility, you shirk that responsibility, you disappear in the relationship. When you do that, you are telling God, I know better than you. And for those who would advise you, well, they disappeared, you need to disappear too, are giving you some bad advice, because God has called us to be different. And in being different, He has not called us to escape that responsibility, but to demonstrate, to exhibit the responsibilities that come from being a different child of God, from being a particular people, a people of God, a people chosen by God. That God has exchanged our dark life, our sinful life, for a saved life. He's taken us from the kingdom of darkness to the kingdom of light. He has transformed us, and in so doing has equipped us to do all He's ever asked us to do. Where are you disappearing in your responsibilities? Where are you hiding out? What responsibilities are you shirking? What duties do you have that you're ignoring? What place in God's kingdom, what role is God commanding and acting and equipping you to do that you've just said, nah, let me just hang out over here with the supplies. I'll just hang out in the kitchen for a little long. I'm going to be over here with the baggage. I'll be over here with the luggage. Just don't call on me to do anything. It doesn't always have to be in the most intimate of relationships that this act of abandonment takes place. But no act of abandonment will ever take place unless you go through the steps as I have revealed them to you today from this story of Samuel and Saul. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for the opportunity to be in your house today. Thank you for this word that you have given us through the life of Saul. Father, even after all these years, he still speaks to us. And where it is not an advisory committee that says this is how we ought to live, it is a cautionary tale telling us how not to live. Father, I pray we'll take it to heart. Help the Holy Spirit to lead and guide and direct us. And as a result, may we follow His promptings. And Father, know that you have called and equipped us to do everything that would bring you honor and glory. Help us fulfill our purpose in every relationship. And Father, in so doing, may we bring honor and glory to your Son, in whose name we pray. Amen.